to another Elastic Community virtual meetup. Today I am joined by Nama Illo, education architect here at Elastic. He will be presenting configuring Elasticsearch index for time series data. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to post those in chat, and we'll have some time at the end for Nama to answer anything. So with that, Nama, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Hello, everyone. I'll be your presenter today. My name is Nama Illo. I'm an Elastic education engineer, been there for about 3 years. Before that, I was working at a company that was using Elastic for a SIM solution, and basically ran a program manager role there, basically helping get off the ground a maintenance department where we really maintain these systems and make sure they didn't topple over. And so the topic I'm basically putting together and talking about today is something a little bit dear to my heart. I think there's a lot of documentation out there. There's a lot of new changes going on, and some of the documentation I think is having trouble kind of keeping up with that, or at least nomenclature, stuff like that. So a lot of new stuff going on. And so my goal in this presentation is to really kind of put a lot of topics, cover a lot of different topics, but that are all really related to this one, kind of configuring an Elasticsearch index. Okay, and so I have a nice little presentation put together. So let me go ahead and just start with that. Let me go ahead and share this. All right, I think everyone can see that. Olivia, please let me know if we can't. All right, let's go ahead and begin. Okay, so configuring Elasticsearch index for time series data. This topic covers a lot of different bases, okay? And I'm a little bit ambitious with how much we're trying to cover, but hopefully all of it together will go ahead and make sense at the end. So yeah, we're gonna cover a lot of stuff. We're gonna cover just basically what an index is, some index fundamentals, what is this time series data we're dealing with, actually go into an index summary, and then cover some other pieces that actually go into this, the ingest pipelines and all the different processors, the index lifecycle policies and the rollovers, the rollover aliases and the different phases. And then we'll actually put it all together using an index template. And then we'll cover the logistics that goes into the index patterns, the naming schemes, data streams even, and how to put it all together using component templates in the settings, mappings, and aliases. And then we have a nice little demo, which I'm going to go ahead and give at the end of this. That kind of puts this whole thing together. All right. Let's go ahead and begin. So we're going to start here with some basic index fundamentals, right? What are we dealing with? Okay, what is an index? Okay, so just to make sure we're not in, nobody's here because we're trying to put together an Excel doc or something like that. We're talking about JSON docs, okay? This little piece of code that goes in and usually sent in through some sort of curl command, usually via an HTTP request and some sort of client software that's being sent out. So this is how we interact with Elasticsearch, okay? JSON in, JSON out, okay? We get basically a command and then we'll get a response back. So let's take a little closer look at this little piece of code, okay? We've got a put command here, and then we have the index name itself, very important. And then you've got the underscore doc endpoint, and then we have a doc ID that we have assigned. We can also do this as a post and leave that ID off, and it'll actually auto-assign it. What else is in this doc? Okay, so we have in here fields and values, okay? A key value pair. So what are fields? Fields could be something like host name, and the value could be Chuck's computer, something like that, okay? So this is what we're talking about, JSON docs, okay? And an index is literally just a way for us to go ahead and store those docs, okay? It's a logical container, a logical way to group all those docs together. And we actually use the terminology is indexing a doc into an index, okay? And so that's what we're dealing with, is basically just these collection of these docs and putting them into this nice little index. All right. A couple of things that we're going to talk about with these indices, okay? When managing data within Elasticsearch, you kind of have two different categories on the data that you're basically putting into your index. We've either got time series or static data, Okay, what I'm dealing with is time series data. What I'm not dealing with is static data. Static data is something like a big group of docs that you put in all at once, okay? And you may add one or two more of those, but usually the doc that you put in the first time is just as valuable as the doc you put in at the very end, okay? That's a little bit different than what I'm dealing with, okay? I'm talking about time series data. Data that we have docs constantly being added into our index, okay? And the index keeps growing larger and larger and larger. It's new docs that have new events that we're trying to collect. And at some point, we're going to have to, well, do something with it because it'll get so large that it'll finally take up all of our resources. Okay, so we have to manage this type of data very differently from our static data. Okay, and that's really what we're trying to do here. So let's talk about this time series data. Okay, and these indices that we have in our system. So big thing about this time series data is the different types that we're actually collecting. Okay, they come in all different types, right? The docs come from, could be a metric from some sort of computer, maybe the system CPU or the memory usage. And so we're collecting that piece of information right now, and it's very, very important. And then we'll go ahead and index that. But usually within a couple of additional seconds or maybe a minute later, a new piece of information is generated, and we have to now collect that as well. And so metrics, as you can imagine, are generating tons of information. What's also interesting is metrics usually are very valuable when you collect them right now, but the ones you collected yesterday aren't very important. And the ones you're about to collect tomorrow, I got to make room for. So metrics is just one type. We also have like diagnostic logs, usually things from a system that's telling a system that it's not working, right? An error message or a critical message finally shows up, but it's usually not happening on a regular basis. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is many different indices for different types of data, okay? Each type of data might actually generate different types of amounts of data. The index might get very large, and or the rate at which it gets added to might be much different than compared to another type. So different indices for different data. Okay, we're getting away from the concept of one index rules them all. Okay, we have many different types. And that's kind of what I'm trying to illustrate, is setting up a couple different indices with different types. All right, so let's break down our index. Okay, go over a little bit of an index summary, and we can kind of see what really options we have to basically change and configure our index. Okay. A lot of things that we can do with our index. In our settings, we have a bunch of things that we can do. We can add what we call an ingest pipeline to control the content that's actually being indexed into our index. We also have an index lifecycle policy that we can add to here and actually manage the index as it gets older. There's a lot more settings that help with controlling the size, the location that we want it to go to, things like that. But these are the ones we're going to focus on. We also have the mappings. Okay, all those fields that that are coming in the doc have to have a specific data type associated with it. Okay, the right data type allows us to use that field in other places in like Kibana apps and such. Okay, and then finally, aliases, a way to basically be able to communicate with that index from sort of outside client. All right. So there's lots of ways or lots of different parts to an index, okay, that we can go ahead and change and configure. How do we go ahead and change that and set it up the way we want to up front? Introducing our index templates, okay? So this is what we're basically going to be configuring today. We're essentially setting up an index template, which gives us the option to go ahead and configure whatever index settings, whatever mappings with their appropriate data types. We can add an ingest pipeline that we want to specify. We can add an index lifecycle policy. All these settings we can go ahead and configure up front, okay, so that the settings so that the index, when it gets created, takes the settings we configure and not the ones the system default settings. Okay, and so anything we don't configure, it'll just take on the system default settings. And that, in my opinion, usually not appropriate for what you're wanting to use within production. All right, so that's kind of what we have in store for us. So let's start out. we're going to start here, and because we got to configure these guys up front. All right. So the first part is what's coming in, our ingest pipelines. What is an ingest pipeline? Well, basically, it's a set of processors that we can take our document and step them through before our doc is completely indexed into our index. Love the verbiage on this. So these processors really can go ahead and essentially clean up that document that we are collecting from our specific source, okay? And essentially, get it in the nice clean way that we can go ahead and use it nicely within Elasticsearch. Here's an example of a dissect processor, okay? So we're pulling this long string from that source, and it has a bunch of information in it, okay? The dissect processor has basically a pattern that we can create that essentially parses out the specific value in that location of that text and assigns it to the specific field that we want. Okay, and now we have a new, clean, very nice, easy to use source content that has each of the fields and their appropriate values separated so that we can use that very easily for searching and everything else. Okay. This is just one processor in the many lists that we have, but is a great example of what it can do. And so that's what you're doing in an ingest pipeline, is just setting up a bunch of processors in the order that you want. It essentially takes that doc through all those. You even have on failure ones in case something doesn't work the way you want. And definitely test, okay? Take a couple of sample documents and test your pipeline with that option there. All right. So once we have our pipeline or ingest pipeline created, now we go ahead and set it up within our index. Okay, so under the index settings, under the default pipeline parameter, we have basically whatever we named that pipeline that we just created. Okay, all right. So now we got a pipeline. What's next? Next, we have to manage the old data. Index lifecycle policy. Let's start this conversation because this one gets deep. So let's start talking about this index that we have that's collecting this type of data that we have. Let's say metrics, for example. Very quickly, we're going to realize that our data falls in two different categories that's in this index. Okay, the stuff we collected right now, super valuable. It keeps us visible to what's going on in that environment right then and there. It's in real time. And we very much have to collect that data so we can see what's going on. We then have to store it so we can make room for the new stuff. So now we have new data and we have old data, right? And the old data becomes less and less valuable the older it gets, okay? A metric of a CPU usage a year ago doesn't do much for me now, okay? So it would be in our best interest, okay, if we're trying to manage this index, to maybe separate what's old and what's new. Okay, introducing a concept here called rollover. So we have now a process called the rollover index, which essentially allows us to set up a couple of conditions that if they are met, like a certain size or a certain age, the index stops getting indexed to. And essentially a new index gets created for the indexing to happen to. All the rest of the indices are still being able to be used and searched against. But now, if you'll notice, we have a numbering system happening to tell us which ones are old and which ones are new. And that allows us to now being able to manage what's old and what's new, okay? Like maybe delete the stuff that gets old enough. So that's what the index lifecycle management allows us to do. It's this rollover process. The only problem that we have, though, is now we have a bunch of different indices, and they all have different names, right? It starts with the same thing, but it ends with this different number. So now how do we go ahead and actually read all these? How do I go ahead and index to the correct single index? So introducing a rollover alias, okay? And it's in the index settings that we can go ahead and specify, and allows us to go ahead and, well, use this name on this rollover process. And so, yeah, There's going to be basically a process on specifying which indices can we read from whenever we do a search, and which index do we index to whenever we do a put command or an index. All right. So that's our rollover aliases that allows us to do that. Okay. What is also fun about the index lifecycle policy is it has these different phases. Okay. As we are rolling our index over, the index has now different properties to it. For example, it's not being indexed to anymore. Okay. We're only reading from it. So maybe as it goes and does this rollover and moves into a different phase, we can have it do different things. Like maybe take on just only read only, turn it to read only, maybe shrink the number of shards, maybe move it to specific hardware. Essentially make it change it to where it uses less overhead on the system. Okay. And then finally, eventually delete it. All right. So we have these different phases. How do we kind of configure or work with these? These get a little confusing. And so that's why I kind of threw this in here. It's just to kind of bring it up. So in our phases, okay, we're going to set up a hot phase. Okay. That's their first phase that your docs usually are going to go to. Your index is going to first move to. And here we can specify to turn on our rollover. Okay. The beauty about putting a rollover into the index lifecycle policy is that you can allow some of your own configurations. You can turn on rollover and it'll use default system settings. They're very good. Not saying anything against them. They're great for production. But you may want to change them. So I can go in here in the rollover and actually customize those specific conditions on when the rollover occurs. So I can do it based on time, based on size, anything like that. So it's in the hot phase and it's just rolled over. Now I'm going to then have the option to move it over into our next phase immediately, right? Because it's already been in the hot phase for 14 days here, and now it's performed the rollover. So now when I have that rollover occur, do I want it to stay in the hot for a little bit longer or move immediately into our warm phase? Okay. If it's immediately into the warm phase, you just set this setting to 0. And then now it is going to go ahead and move into that warm phase and take on whatever actions you wanted to have happen in the warm phase. Maybe shrink it, maybe change the number of shards, move it to a hardware, all that sort of stuff. And then eventually we will want to define when it's supposed to be deleted. Okay, so if we have it already going in hot for a certain number of days, how many days do we want it to be in warm before it's deleted? Again, remember, this setting is based on the time of rollover, not based on the time the doc first got created or the index first got created. It's a little confusing, but hopefully that helped. So when we have our index lifecycle policy set up, okay, we're going to go into settings, go into index lifecycle and set up the name that we just gave the policy we just created. And of course, the very important rollover alias that we'll use to point to so we can go ahead and communicate with this and all the different indices that are getting created in the back. All right, moving on. Now we're going to try and put all this together. All right, index templates. Here we go. So what are index templates, right? Gives us an option to configure our index the way we want before the index is created, okay? And so an index basically has different logistics that we can configure, component templates that we can use, and all the settings, mappings, and aliases. All right. So let's start with the logistics section. There's a lot of stuff on here, but this is a big topic here. So this thing that we're going to start with is how do we match the index? So in order to apply the settings we have in the index template, we have to create an index that will match what we call our index pattern. So the name of your index is what matters. It does not matter, and we can't match on anything in the doc itself. So no field values or anything like that. So the name is what counts. Okay, and so we just have to create an index pattern that has some characters that are going to match the exact same characters to whatever name you gave your index. All right. So if we're only able to match based on the name, and the name is the only way that we can actually see what type of data is in that index, naming becomes really important. Okay. And so introducing a naming scheme that we essentially are actually using with all of our managed index templates. Okay, so anything that's managed through Elasticsearch, like any of the fleet agents, okay, or previously known as beats, these all are configured this way. Okay, they're all configured with a specific naming scheme so that they can allow for basically being able to tell what's in that index just by looking at it. Okay, they put in 3 pieces of info: a type, such as metrics or logs, okay, the data set, like where that's being pulled from, like an Apache firewall or system CPU, okay, and then maybe one additional spot, the namespace, which maybe one additional differentiator, maybe test environment or production, something like that, okay. What they also do in our managed index templates, okay, is also adding that same information that's in the name to the docs themselves. Okay, they pull those values and add them to these constant keyword fields: index name.type, dataset, and namespace. Okay, and that way, essentially, it allows for this, right? Being able to access all the different indices, and then still being able to search against specific values within the docs themselves. Okay. So will this be turned on and set up for you by default? No. Okay. The only ones that are set up there by default are the managed index templates. So all I'm recommending is that you follow this naming scheme. Okay. Because it's not going to be done for you. Okay. Just by, yeah. Okay. Next, the additional option that is on the logistics page. Okay, and a lot of people give me grief on where to start talking about this, but it's on the logistics page, so I'm going to talk about it here. One of the options that you have on the logistics page is to turn on something called a data stream. And all the data stream does is now give a name that we can use to communicate with that allows us to essentially communicate with all the indices that are now being rolled over and created. Basically, you may recognize this slide from earlier under the rollover alias. Matter of fact, it's almost exactly the same. Matter of fact, the data stream name is now what we communicate with, and that's the one that helps us point to which index to be read from and which one we're supposed to singly index to. And a lot of people go, well, which one should I use, rollover alias or data stream? Well, picture this. Data stream allows us to go ahead and create a rollover without the index lifecycle policy. Matter of fact, it was crucial that we do this because on all the managed index templates, you aren't expected to add an index lifecycle policy, but you still get the rollover option. Okay, we would have to manually add these policies to our templates if we wanted them to have rollover. Now we have rollover just by turning it on. And then you go, well, that seems like the better option. And I go, well, remember, all you're doing is flipping the switch. You're not setting any sort of conditions or custom settings on when the rollover happens and what it's supposed to do when the rollover happens. So in order to control those settings of your rollover, use data stream, but also use it with an index lifecycle policy that actually defines all those. And then you go, well, I created an index lifecycle policy. I even created a rollover alias. Which one is it going to use? Data stream name or rollover alias? It uses data stream. As soon as you use data stream, it actually overwrites that rollover alias name, and that becomes irrelevant. You only can communicate with this data stream name to all those different indices. We're going to illustrate both options in my demo. Okay, but that's all really your data stream is doing. All right. And how does that actually, the next question that you're going to ask is, well, how do I give the name of my data stream? Remember, in our rollover alias, we were able to specify what that was. Here, all we're doing is turning on an option that says data stream. So where does data stream get its name that we're going to start using to communicate with? This is how it works. The index name that matches the index pattern will be the name of the data stream. Okay? So here's an example. Here's to go ahead and start things off. We do a post with metrics example. Here's our index name. We've got an index pattern called metrics star. What will be the new data stream name? Metrics example, because it matched the index pattern and now it created it and it basically gave it its name. Yeah, it's again why we have so much put into this new naming scheme. Okay, there's a reason why we put so much effort to it, because that's how these data stream names are being created, and so now I can essentially recognize them based on those names. All right, let's keep going. After we're done with the logistics, we have the rest of the settings. Okay, so we have our component templates. This is what I highly recommend putting all your energy into. Okay, creating many, many different component templates. There are so many different settings available within an index that you can customize. Putting each of those little custom settings in one line of code into a component template allows for us to make one master or a couple of master index templates and interchangeably swap out which component templates we want for the specific code we want. Okay, and allows for you to go ahead and actually just save those and use those for many different index templates. Okay, so I highly recommend putting everything into these. It'll make things a lot easier. All right. So some of the things that we can specify and configure within our index settings. We've kind of gone into this a little bit, but in our index template, we're going to go ahead and mess around with this. So routing allocation, okay, making sure these go into the hot phase of our index lifecycle policy. Also maybe shard size, okay? I'm not going to go into what your production settings may or should be. I'm basically doing a very small miniature demo that hopefully you could expand on, okay? So yeah, these aren't recommended settings at all. These are just things that you can do in here. All right, also, we're going to assign the index lifecycle or policy that we just created. Also, the default pipeline. So all of our docs that go into this index all get scrubbed. Mappings, okay? What are good things to put in the mappings for an index? Have somebody else do the work for you, okay? Follow these guidelines. The Elasticsearch Common Schema guidelines basically outline all these different fields for you to use. Granted, they're all the IT quote unquote industry, but it really does most of the work for you. They tell you the data types you should be using, specific nomenclature and everything for it. So really, really good help there. Data types, okay. Multi-fields here, assign analyzers here, all kinds of cool things that we can do. Depending on the data type you have for a field, we can use it for different apps and things like Kibana and such. The last one I'm going to mention is the date field. Okay, the at timestamp. Anytime we're trying to quote unquote classify an index as time series data, it means it has a timestamp. What is old compared to what is new? So, and even data streams themselves can't really get created until you see this timestamp field. All right. The last piece to this, okay, is how do we communicate with our index from some sort of outside client? Okay, I don't want to give them the name of my indices, okay, mostly so that, well, I want to give them a different named resource that they can use to communicate with my indices, because if I ever want to, I can maybe turn that off, okay? I can turn that off and maybe point it to a different index or something like that. And so we've given essentially two different options on how to go ahead and communicate with rollover indices. Right? You have your rollover alias option, and then you have your data stream option. You kind of have to do one or the other, okay? And I'm in this demo going to illustrate doing it for both. Okay, we're going to go and choose both options. All right. So how do we start things off? Okay, how do we start things off using a rollover alias? That requires this first step, okay, bootstrapping the index. So we've set everything up in an index template. We have all the settings we want. And we have an alias that we want to start using to communicate with. So the alias doesn't exist yet because the index doesn't exist yet. So in order for this all to start and for us to being able to start communicating and sending data to this, we need this first bootstrap process. Okay, it's a put command with the first index. Okay, whatever name we gave it, and then this 00001 numbering system at the very end. Okay, and then we're adding the alias that this is supposed to communicate with, or the alias name where the alias is communicating with, and we specify that this is the one that we are going to be indexing to. Somebody might ask, well, why can't I put this in my template? Well, that means the template, any new index comes in, that alias is supposed to point to that one. So this is a one-time thing that we do. After this, then we can just start communicating with it using the alias name. All right. That's how to do it with rollover alias. If we want to add an alias to the data stream, we can do that as well. Okay. So instead of just communicating and sending data to the data stream name, we can actually use an alias, come up with whatever it is. We just have to tell the alias that we're indexing to the data stream, okay, instead of the rollover alias. All right, let's put it all together in our demo. Okay, give me a second here. Let me pull this up. I think I have this here. All right. I think I'm seeing screens, so let's go ahead and begin. Really quick, before I start the demo, I just want to point out some of these, it's hard to recreate my demo because I'm putting some pretty strict timings on this. The system defaults actually are every 10 seconds for index lifecycle polling interval. Sorry, every 10 minutes. So I've adjusted this system cluster settings to 10 seconds only for this demo. I wouldn't recommend doing this in your own production environment unless you absolutely need to. But yeah, if it doesn't work the same way on your own, this demo, just know that that's probably why. All right, so what am I going to do first? So we're going to go ahead and actually set some things up. Okay, so I'm in Kibana right now under Stack Management. And in Stack Management, I can start out with my ingest pipelines. And what we have to start out with is our demo pipeline. What have I put in this pipeline? So I've done a couple different things. I've done a set processor. We're going to add a field called hello and give it a value of world. Okay. I'm also putting a date processor, which is essentially finding a field, this ingest.timestamp field, which is actually conveniently a field that gets added every time a doc gets indexed. And so we're pulling the value of that in whatever format it comes in and adding it to a very important field that we need for each doc called the timestamp field. Okay. So now that I have that, I can actually be considered time series data. So that's my pipeline. Now let's go down to index lifecycle policy. Index lifecycle policy, I have one here that I've created to illustrate how our rollover is going to occur. Okay, so things first go into our hot phase, and then we have some advanced settings here, and I've overridden the recommended defaults, and I've done some very aggressive settings here. Okay, every 10 seconds, this is going to roll over. Okay, or every 5 documents. When it rolls over, it will then go immediately, okay, after 0 seconds into our warm phase, which then it's going to do things like change the number of replicas, shrink the index to only one primary shard, and also make it read-only. We're essentially trying to, it's all in an effort to make it cause least overhead on our system. What do each of these do and specifically do? You can always look that up. All right, and then finally, we're going to actually delete it after a total of 1 minute from the initial rollover. Okay, so we've got ingest pipeline to control what's coming in, and we've got a lifecycle policy to go ahead and control what's going out. Now let's go ahead and control our index templates. So I've created 2 different templates. I've got a logs template and a metrics template. And what you'll find is they're made up of all these component templates, okay? And actually none of the settings really show up. But because everything is put into the code in the component templates, you can see the full command here, okay? And here you'll see that I've actually added the index lifecycle policy, the rollover alias, I have routing allocation, I got the default pipeline, I've got the mappings that I've configured, even the properties for the field that I added, okay? And you can even come in and see each of these component templates here, okay? And so, yeah, each one just having a little piece of code in it, okay? So I've got mappings here, I've got a pipeline specified here, all these different pieces. Everything essentially in our 2 indices is going to be the same except our rollover alias. Okay, rollover alias for 1 is going to be my logs, while we're also trying to communicate with our other data, which is rollover alias metrics right here. All right. What I'm also going to do is set up 2 different indices, one that's going to go ahead and be a data stream and one that's not. Okay. And so I just kind of want to illustrate how they both work differently. Okay, so this kind of goes over all the different component templates, okay? And so what we're going to start out with is our logs template, okay? This index pattern, demo logs, it's not a data stream, mind you, okay? It is using a rollover alias of logs, my logs. Okay, let's go ahead and test that out. Yeah, we'll come back to the other one once we go to that one. So here we go. So I'm going to start here. Do I have any indices? I do not. So what I'm trying to essentially do is have 2 different indices, 2 types of indices. Okay, one I'm going to go ahead and use, communicate with using a my logs alias, and we're going to use a rollover alias option. The other one is the my metrics, and we're going to use data stream option. Okay, so let's start here. So the first step that we have to do with the rollover alias option is our bootstrap. Okay, so I have a demo logs index with the 00001. I've specified the alias is the right alias, is I'm pointing to the my logs rollover alias. The naming of these is very confusing. I don't know why it's called a rollover alias, and then also these are called aliases. It makes you think it's the same thing, but they are 2 little different settings, okay? All right, so I'm going to start this off. And now we have an index that's created. So the first test, can I communicate with it using my logs alias? Oh, it looks like we can. I can pull up all the different index settings right here, and it looks like it got all these things that I had configured in my index template. Matter of fact, can I start, did it get added to the index lifecycle policy? Well, as a matter of fact, it did, and it's actually in the rollover process, so it's actually even shrinking already, okay? And so now I can start sending some docs to it. And sure enough, I can communicate with the demo log 003 all from my logs alias. So I'm indexing to it. Can I search and get those docs back? I sure can. Here they all are. And look at that. It has a nice little timestamp on these docs. It even has the new field that I added. All right. And so what is going on now with the rollover? Let's take a look. So check this out. What is happening? So we have the 0001. And look, it was shrank. Okay. The youngest index is this 0004. Okay. It has what we start out with is 2 shards. And basically after the shrink, it goes to 1 shard. Okay. It doesn't matter if there's docs in this index or not. The rollover is going to continue based on the conditions I set. So at this point, you can keep doing this and you'll find that the indices keep getting more. Okay, it keeps rolling over to a new one. Luckily, I have the delete set up, and this will eventually start deleting the older ones. All right. And again, I can access this all through my logs, and I can start to see all the different indices getting created. Okay, that was our first template. So let's go back and take a look at the other template we're going to use now. Okay, so this one is going to be a little bit different. Index template, we're going to come here and do the metrics this time. Metrics is a little bit different. It has almost everything the same. I'm even specifying a myMetrics rollover alias. I'm also turning on the single option in the logistics to go ahead and tell this to be a data stream. So let's see the difference in action. All right. This is where things get right away a little different, okay? So my logs we did. So now I'm trying my metrics. So now I have the same command, right, that I did earlier, the bootstrap process. It even specifies the myMetrics alias, okay? I'm trying to do the same thing I did to the last one, but because I have this on as a data stream, watch what happens. First of all, it won't let it work. It says, hey, it matched an index template that was turned on as a data stream. You can only use create data API instead. Wow. Okay. So really, what do I got to do to start this off? Really, all you have to do is start it off with the name that you want to give it and a post command. Boom. And sure enough, check it out what it does. Okay, it starts to change the name and it starts to add the 0001 all on its own. Okay, so again, this is like turning on rollovers without an index lifecycle policy. This is just through the template itself. The only reason why we have an index lifecycle policy applied to this is so we can control the rollover settings. All right, and so I'm going to keep adding more and more and more to that. And now check it out. We now have a new data stream. And look at the data stream name, demo metrics, because that's the name I had that index that I used that matched the template. So I can access these using demo metrics. Great. I can access the indices. Perfect. I can even search using the demo metrics. But remember, this is not what we wanted when we started. I wanted to be able to communicate with this with the name myMetrics. So does myMetrics even work? Because remember, we had that where in the index lifecycle or in the rollover alias name, we added that to the template. So does myMetrics even get recognized? No, it doesn't. Okay. If I want to now communicate with this data stream using a different name, I can then create an alias, but I just have to post the alias to that specific data stream name. Okay, now that's added, and now I can start sending to the myMetrics alias, and it goes to, guess what, the demo metrics data stream. And I can still search against it, brings back my docs. I can even actually look at all the different indices. And what do we see? So we see rollover happening with the metrics and the rollover happening with the logs, okay? And so you're going to have a bunch of different indices all created, but they're all going to be accessed like they're one index when you're using these aliases. And eventually they'll get deleted based on that index lifecycle policy. If you ever want to check where things are in the mix, okay, here you go. Okay, warm process is here for this index number 000011. Here's the warm one. Here's the shrink. Oh, and there's even some that are eventually going to be deleted. Okay, and so they are getting deleted as well. So that's making sure everything's working the way we want. We've just set up 2 indices, one against one different template and one for a data stream template. All right. And so last but not least, that's all I got. Okay. Thank you for your time. That's the demo I have. The remainder of the time is for any questions or Anything else?
It looks like there's one from earlier in the presentation.
Okay, great.
And it's a two-part question. Are there processor pipeline components that can do keyword counts as augmentations to the data? And the second part is more of an example.
There are many different processors. Specifically, can it do that? I would say probably, but I wouldn't know for sure. I would have to do a little bit more research on which one to do that. That's a customized processor. So yeah, I wouldn't know specifically which one it is, but it's certainly, I think, something we could do. I just have to do some more research on it. Took me a little bit to find the ones for adding that date field to it, but that was a cool little trick that I was able to find. But it took some digging. But yeah, the list of processors is quite extensive, and so I would yeah, that's where I would start to keep searching. But yeah, you can post that question, I think, to community and probably get a little bit better of a response for something more specific to your use case.
Yeah, feel free to post on Discuss or join our Elastic community Slack channel. And the team is very helpful there. Yeah. That was the only other question. So if anyone, again, if anyone has questions throughout watching this after the fact, again, Discuss and the community Slack channel is a great resource. But yeah, that's all I have. Nama, any final thoughts on your wrap up?
Thank you for everybody's time today. I really appreciate it. Hopefully this was informative. All right. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
All right. Bye.